There was a lot of movement in America after World War II in terms of where people lived and who lived in America. This slideshow covers content statement 29, the continuing population flow from cities to suburbs, the internal migration from Rust Belt to Sun Belt, and the increase in immigration resulting from passage of the 1965 Immigration Act have had social and political effects. If you completed the economic boom after World War II reading, you have already learned that there was a growth in population in suburbs in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. The growth in population was primarily white people moving out of the cities and into the suburbs. This meant that the demographic makeup of suburbs was primarily white, while the percentage of the city population that was African American increased as a result of fewer whites remaining in the city. Redlining was a term that referred to the refusal of banks to approve loans to African Americans in certain neighborhoods, often wealthier areas, including suburbs. The suburbs weren't predominantly white because African Americans didn't want to live in the suburbs. It was because housing practices often denied a person of color the opportunity to buy a house in a suburb. The population shift of whites out of cities continued the polarization of political parties between urban and rural areas. Rural areas, meaning places out in the country, tended to be more likely to vote Republican, and urban areas or cities tended to be more likely to vote Democratic. As you may have noticed in the most recent presidential election, this split continues to this day. Riots happened multiple times in cities across the U.S. during the 1960s in response to continued troubles for the African American community. The Watts riots in 1965 and riots in Detroit in 1967 became national headlines. Following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968, rioting happened in over 100 cities across the country, including in Youngstown, Ohio. The Rust Belt is the areas that were industrial powerhouses in the late 1800s and early 1900s, places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. By the 1950s and 1960s, many of these industrial powers dealt with closing factories, thus the name Rust Belt. The southern and western U.S. saw a surge of factory openings, especially in defense and high-tech industries during the 1950s and 1960s. The southern and western U.S. became known as the Sun Belt. These Sun Belt states saw its population grow during this time. The growth in population meant more seats in Congress and more electoral votes in presidential elections. Notice the electoral map from 1952. Ohio had 25 electoral votes, but in the most recent 2020 presidential election, that number has decreased to 18. Pennsylvania had 32 electoral votes in 1952, but only 20 in 2020. This shows how the Rust Belt has lost political power. Compare that to Florida with only 10 electoral votes in 1952 and now 29 in 2020, or Texas with 24 in 1952 and 38 in 2020. The shifting population in the country has changed which areas of our country have the most political power. The new air conditioner technology made living in the warmer southern and western states more appealing, which helped to spur this population growth as well. Since the 1920s, immigration to America was limited. That changed with the Immigration Act of 1965. The largest influx of immigrants to America since 1965 has come from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Of those areas, the largest influx comes from Latin America. Latin America includes Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Before the Immigration Act of 1965, most immigrants to America came from Europe. But that has changed since 1965. Now, the largest group of immigrants to the U.S. are from Latin America. The bar graph shows that. Hispanic Americans speak Spanish. As a result, with such a large new population that at least initially speaks Spanish as their primary language, there has been an increase in Spanish language media and bilingual education in America. Go to a store and you may see signs printed in both English and Spanish. That is because of the increased population from Spanish-speaking countries since 1965. Movement from city to suburb, Rust Belt to Sun Belt, and new immigrants from places such as Latin America, Africa, and Asia has changed the demographics of our country. It has also influenced elections and the balance of power between the major political parties, Democrats and Republicans. Now answer this question. Before the 1950s, most immigrants to the U.S. came from Europe. Which change in immigration policy was reflected in the 1965 Immigration Act? A. It set large quotas to encourage European immigration. B. It enforced a complete ban on immigration from China. C. It imposed stricter quotas on immigration from every country. Or D. It allowed more immigration from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In recent years, print advertisements for some fast food chains have featured text written in multiple languages. One reason for this trend has been an increase in A. Segregation of ethnic groups, B. Immigration to the United States, C. Urbanization and suburbanization, D. Emigration from the United States. One final question. Suburbanization in the U.S. had many social and political effects. Select all of the effects related to suburbanization. A large part of the urban population was African American. Loss of job opportunities in cities contributed to urban riots. Suburban residents were more likely to be Republican. Or the populations of cities grew increasingly poor. Hopefully you selected all four of those, as all four were effects related to suburbanization.